Chapter 1. Liz Peterson hurried along the sidewalk, avoiding the shallow puddles and shielding her head from the raindrops with her newly checked-out library book on Western civilization. Why had she decided to walk to the library this morning? It was only a 3-block walk to the off-campus apartment she shared with Carla, but the soggy New York weather made the trip seem more like 100 miles. If only Mom and Dad had bought her a car for graduation like all her friends' parents had done for their children. Then she wouldn't be in this mess. She rolled her eyes as she remembered the late-night argument a few months ago about her so-called sense of entitlement. Liz picked up her pace. Maybe she should have heeded the weatherman's warnings instead of looking at the sky and deciding that rain wasn't likely this afternoon. A passing car lurched into a puddle and splashed water everywhere, drenching Liz from ponytail to socks. She sputtered, clenched her teeth, and lowered the dripping book to her side. No use trying to stay dry now. And she still had 2 blocks between where she stood and the warm, dry clothes waiting in her apartment. She wiped the lingering droplets from her eyelashes and trudged along. Good thing Carla was away for the weekend and wouldn't wonder why Liz was half drowned in murky street water. A policeman in an unmarked car pulled to the curb and rolled down the passenger's side window. "Are you all right, miss? I saw what happened. That guy got you good." Liz slowed to a trot and answered the fresh-faced young man in a blue uniform. "Yeah, I'm okay, thanks. My place is just up there." She indicated the direction with her chin. "I'll dry off when I get home." The corner of the man's mouth turned up in a sympathetic smile as his bright blue eyes scanned her disheveled, soggy appearance. He opened his mouth to speak, but paused. He looked at his watch and nodded. "You just need to go up the street. I can give you a quick lift if you want to avoid another incident and get out of the rain. I've got a few minutes." He reached over and pushed the passenger's door open with a grunt. "Hop in." Liz took a step forward and stopped. Something inside her sleep-deprived college brain told her she shouldn't accept a ride from a stranger. "But this guy's a cop, and he's just trying to be nice since he saw me get pummeled with water. Besides, he's kinda cute." Still, she pressed her lips together. "Can I see your badge?" She blushed. She must sound like such a scared little girl to him. Without a flicker of hesitation or offense evident on his face, the policeman flipped open a black booklet and flashed a shiny gold badge with the word deputy across the front. Liz swallowed the last of her hesitation and slipped into the dry passenger seat. Sorry. Trained by overprotective parents. It's a hard habit to shake. She remembered to buckle up before her law-enforcing friend had to ask it of her. The policeman grinned again. "That's actually a blessing in disguise. Wish more young ladies were as cautious. It would make my job a lot easier." He flicked on his turn signal and eased out into traffic. "Thank you for doing this," Liz said. "I live at the Thistlebrook building 2 blocks up and on the right." "Thistlebrook, huh? Lots of college students in that place. I get regular calls about them disturbing the peace. You seem too smart and pretty to be mixed up in that kind of crowd, though." Liz shook her head and felt her cheeks heating again. "I stay away from the parties and the drinking. Anyway, I'm only 19. My parents would kill me if they caught wind of it. But they do live all the way in Miami, so how would they find out, right?" She winked and giggled to punctuate her joke. His carefree laugh put her at ease. "What about your roommate?" "Oh, she avoids all that stuff too. She's a real goody-goody, actually. Goes home to Pennsylvania every weekend because she gets homesick and wants to go to church with her parents or something. That's where she is now. I like having the place to myself, though. If I could afford it, I'd live alone all the time." The policeman looked as if he were deep in thought, then he straightened behind the wheel. "I'm Officer Dan, by the way." He took his right hand off the steering wheel and held it out to her. "What's your name?" "Elizabeth Peterson." "Everyone calls me Liz." After she shook his warm hand, he resumed his relaxed grip on the steering wheel. "Here's your stop," Officer Dan said as he pulled to the curb. "It was nice meeting you, Liz." She thanked him again for the ride and turned to open the door. But as she did, something hard and unforgiving bashed into the back of her skull. A scream stuck in her throat and everything went black. Chapter 2. Liz moaned and reached for her pounding head, but the motion made her wrists scream in pain. Why couldn't she open her eyes? The irritating screech of metal scraping on metal stopped her movements short. She was handcuffed. Why? What happened? Panic clogged her throat and stole her oxygen as she forced herself to lift her heavy eyelids and focus on her surroundings. The room that met her bleary gaze sat dark and damp. She inhaled slowly through her nose and coughed. Mothballs. Shifting her weight, she found herself kneeling on a gritty, cold cement floor. The handcuffs wound her arms around a metal pipe. Her jeans were still a bit damp from her walk in the rain, but it had obviously been hours since she'd been exposed to the elements. Her shoes were missing. So were her socks, oddly enough, and her cell phone from her back pocket. Dizziness tickled her temples, but she ignored it, trying to take in as much information about the room as she could, distracting her body from flipping the switch to activate full-force anxiety mode. A small sliver of light trickled in from the top of a rotting wooden staircase, and Liz studied the cracked open door above, hoping her captor wasn't nearby. As her eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, she glanced behind her, careful not to make too much noise and alert the psychopath that she was now conscious. A blue police uniform hung on a wire hanger just out of reach. Liz cringed. So Officer Dan was probably an imposter. Great. Her head throbbed, and she tried to hold back the tears welling up under her eyes. Crying wasn't going to solve this. She swallowed the dry lump in her throat and tried to slow down her thundering heartbeat. Neither was a panic attack. What she needed was a plan. There had to be something useful within her foot's reach. If she could just feel around for a pair of pliers, a wrench, or a hammer, she might be able to jar the pipe loose and make a run for it up those stairs and out the door. She stretched one leg as far as it could reach and started feeling around the cold floor with her bare toes. A creaking floorboard overhead turned her muscles to ice. He was here. She'd never been big on prayer before, but her lips mouthed a silent, "Help me." Her booming pulse almost drowned out the sound of footsteps closing in on the door at the top of the stairs. Should she pretend to be unconscious? Maybe he'd leave her alone for a little longer while her headache subsided and she could think more clearly. The basement door flung open, and Liz closed her eyes against the flood of light and went limp at the wrists before she had decided what to do. Jaw clenched to stop her teeth from rattling, she listened to the sound of boots on concrete and tried not to show any signs of being aware of an eerie presence. A rough hand grabbed her face, and it took all of her willpower not to pop open her eyes or cry out in surprise. "Wake up, my dear," the man cooed. That voice definitely belonged to Officer Dan. Or whoever he really was. Liz ignored his plea and tried to relax her muscles, though metal bit mercilessly into her skin as the weight of her body pulled on the handcuffs. The man released his grip on her face and took a step closer. Liz could smell the alcohol on his breath and wanted to puke. "I said wake up," he bellowed as he slapped Liz's cheek with a force she was sure knocked a few teeth loose. Her eyes flew open of their own accord, and she let out a sharp cry. The left side of her face tingled madly, and the taste of fresh blood covered her tongue. Her bottom lip was numb, and she was sure it was already starting to swell. "Oh, good. You're awake." The kidnapper paced in front of her and smirked. His clear blue eyes that had looked so inviting earlier now held an unstable wildness, darting back and forth, left and right, at an alarming rate. "We're going to play a little game, you and I. I'm going to ask you some questions. If I like your answers, you will get rewarded. If I don't, you will get punished. Ready?" "Not really," Liz murmured under her breath. The second blow hurt worse than the first. Blood oozed into her mouth and she spat it on a nearby pile of dirt. "Wrong answer," the man said in a sing-song voice while wagging his index finger. "Try to do better next time, sweetie." He scraped a dusty wooden chair across the floor and sat down to stare into his prisoner's eyes. Liz averted her gaze and clenched her teeth. He wouldn't see her chin quiver. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "What is your name?" he asked. Liz hesitated. She already told him her name in the car, so he'd know if she was lying. She shrunk as far away from him as she could before she answered truthfully. "Elizabeth." He raised his hand and smacked the other side of her face this time, his crazy eyes burning hot as he stood over her to scream in her ear. "No. Your name is Teresa. Teresa. Do you understand?" He sat back in his seat and caught his breath. "I'll ask you again. What is your name?" "Teresa." Liz whimpered and steeled herself for another blow. "That's better." The game continued for what felt like hours, though there was no way to tell how much time had truly passed. Liz tried to answer the crazy man's questions in an acceptable way to avoid more pain, but it proved hard to predict the correct answers. "Do you like it here?" "Yes." Crack! More blood dripped to the floor. "Tell the truth."
Okay. No. I don't like it here yet, but I'll try. I really will. I'm sure I can learn to like it.
Liz broke down and sobbed. "You're showing progress, Teresa. Don't lie to me again." When her captor tired of his game, or perhaps when he deemed her spirit broke into his liking, he stood. "I'm going to bring you upstairs now. If you run, if you scream, if you try to pull any funny business, I will kill you. But not before I kill the people closest to you. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson in Miami for starters." His calm, even voice was more terrifying than his angry shouts. Liz's eyes widened and her body shivered. Why had she offered up that information? The man unlocked the handcuffs from around the pipe and secured her arms behind her back. Then he led her up the rickety staircase into a small living room with a fireplace, a threadbare rug, and a green sofa. A small television flickered in the kitchen to her right. Other than the soft music from a jewelry commercial and the incessant hum of a refrigerator, the place was silent. No engines, no sirens, no voices. Wherever they were, it was a world apart from her apartment in the city. The man shoved her into the bathroom between the two larger rooms and pushed her to her knees on the grimy tiled floor. A large knife glinted from its resting place in the sink. Liz wanted to jump up and run away at the sight of it, but she had no strength left in her bones. "Bad day to skip lunch." "It's time for a change, Teresa." The man snatched the knife, and Liz squeezed her eyes shut and grew rigid, expecting to feel the sharp blade plunge into her back any second. She wasn't ready to die. Why hadn't she taken Carla up on her standing invitation to go home with her this weekend? Then all she'd have to worry about was what to wear to Carla's church tomorrow morning. God, help me. She braced herself for the knife's impact, but instead of stabbing her, the man made quick work of hacking fistful after fistful of her long, dark hair until it lay limp and lifeless on the floor. Liz wheezed a grateful sigh as she spotted a dented box of blonde hair dye resting next to the faucet. He was just changing her appearance, not murdering her. At least not yet. The man ripped open the dye box and proceeded to treat the uneven tufts left on Liz's scalp with the solution. He then unlocked the handcuffs. You can use the toilet while that sets, but no tricks, Teresa. I'm warning you. He lumbered to the kitchen and sat noisily in a wooden chair. Liz rubbed her raw wrists as she wondered if she would get in trouble for closing the bathroom door. She quietly shut it most of the way, but didn't latch it. The last thing she needed was another knock on the head. It would be wise to avoid getting a concussion for as long as possible. She flushed the toilet and avoided looking at her tear-stained reflection in the mirror as she washed her hands in the frigid water. The nutcase was right about one thing, anyway. She wasn't Liz anymore. Chapter 3. After the man rinsed and dried Liz's hair with surprising gentleness, he carefully tended to her wounds and gave her a piece of dry toast and a glass of warm tap water for dinner. The clock hanging on the kitchen wall read 6:30. No wonder she was starving. The drastic shift in the man's mood made Liz's heart stutter, and she didn't know if she should be relieved or panicked that he was suddenly treating her with kindness. She wasn't surprised to learn that the man didn't want to be called Officer Dan anymore. He said his name was Ted, and he looked as if he would backhand her again when she softly inquired after his last name. Liz held her tongue for the rest of the evening. The hours after dinner dragged on, and she was bored out of her mind sitting in the living room on the couch as Ted watched television in the kitchen, looking in on her every few minutes. It was better than sharing a room with him, sure, but she was growing antsy. She couldn't wait until Ted fell asleep so she could try to find a way out of the creepy old coffin. But her hopes of a nighttime escape were dashed when Ted secured the handcuffs to the radiator next to the couch and told her that was where she'd be sleeping. You understand, don't you, Teresa? Once I learn to trust you again, you can come back upstairs with me. Until then, this is how things have to be. He sighed after he fastened the lock and lumbered up the stairs to what Liz assumed to be his bedroom. She shuddered. If her only choices were to sleep chained to a radiator or snuggled up next to crazy Ted, she'd pick the radiator every time. After an unsuccessful hour-long attempt to unlock the handcuffs with a paperclip she'd found on the floor and gripped with her toes, Liz decided she'd have a better chance of escape once Ted freed her wrists. She scanned the living room for a weapon and found a fire iron near the fireplace. Perfect. Now all she needed was the opportunity to use it. And the courage. She stayed up late into the night studying everything she could see in the dusk light, unable to find a comfortable position for snoozing. Eventually, the trauma of the day caught up with her, and she drifted into a dreamless sleep. Liz awoke to the morning news blaring on TV. She listened carefully, hoping that somehow someone had seen her getting clubbed in the head and had reported her missing. No luck. Carla wouldn't be back until her Tuesday morning classes, and by the time she realized Liz wasn't coming home Tuesday night, it could be too late. Why had she gone to the library yesterday? Why hadn't she just studied at her desk in her apartment? Why had she agreed to take that stupid ride from Officer Dan? Her gaze landed on the iron rod leaned against the brick fireplace. She had to get herself out of this mess. Carla would tell her to pray and trust God, but what good had that done so far? God hadn't sent any help like she'd asked. She was on her own. The stairs moaned, and Liz looked up to meet Ted's gaze. Maybe she should try a different approach with him. Resistant and terrified wasn't working. If he was expecting her to rebuild his trust, she'd be as pleasant as possible. Maybe he'd let his guard down and allow her a little freedom. Then she could grab her weapon and fight like crazy for her life. She swallowed the hard lump in her throat and ignored her trembling fingers. The rudimentary plan was the only thing she could think up, and it might not work at all. On the plus side, however, even if she failed, she wouldn't be sleeping beside the deranged lunatic tonight. How did you sleep? She smiled sweetly and winced at the bitter taste the words produced in her mouth. He cocked his head, examining her as if to try and detect any deception. When he was satisfied at her level of sincerity, he simply grunted. Well, a grunt was better than a slap across the cheek, anyway. He made coffee, ate a bowl of oatmeal, watched the television, listened to his police scanner, then unlocked Liz from the radiator. Here. He handed her a bruised apple, and she grabbed it before he changed his mind. Thank you, she whispered, trying not to let sarcasm taint her spoken words. She hoped he didn't see her gaze flit to the fireplace. Ted studied her while she ate, and Liz assumed he was sizing her up, seeing if he'd be able to overpower her when she wasn't in shackles. He was pretty tall, but Liz figured a few well-placed swings with the fire iron could help her get the jump on him. After that though, she didn't know what she could do. From her post on the couch last night, she discovered that the front door was secured from the inside with several combination locks, and thick metal bars blocked every window. Beyond the windows were trees and sky. They were probably in the middle of nowhere. She didn't see a phone or a laptop in the entire downstairs, and even if Ted hadn't hidden her cell, she probably wouldn't get any reception out here. Her hope for a simple escape was dwindling quickly. Teresa, it's high time you learn how to keep a tidy house. I'm going upstairs to get dressed. When I come back down, I expect this house to be clean. Do you understand? Yes. Liz nodded enthusiastically, wondering what would happen to her if she failed his inspection. He turned to tend the fireplace, and Liz's heart dropped into the pit of her stomach. Oops. Can't be leaving this down here. Someone could get hurt. He lifted the iron poker and slung it over his shoulder like an axe. After he trudged upstairs, Liz let her tears fall freely. With blurry vision and lead feet, she got to work on her assignment. As she filled the sink to wash the dishes, she quietly opened every cabinet drawer to see if she could find any scraps of paper with combinations written on them. No such luck. She straightened up the living room and kitchen, searching every nook, cranny, and crack for something useful, not all that thankful that Ted seemed to be a minimalist. She hurriedly washed, dried, and put away the dishes, looking high and low for the knife Ted had used yesterday, or anything sharper than the drawer full of harmless butter knives, forks, and spoons. She gripped a peeler, but realized if she stuffed it in her pocket and he found it, he'd probably use it on her. Frustrated at her fruitless efforts, a sense of doom settled quietly around her soul. God, Carla believes in you. Prove you're real. Prove you care. Help me out of this. Silence met her prayer, and she blew out a shaky breath. All she could do now was wait. Wait and hope someone noticed that she was missing before Tuesday night. Ted hadn't hit her yet today. As long as she stayed alive and unharmed, there was still a chance she'd be rescued. Just don't make him angry. When Liz heard footsteps on the stairs as she dried the last dish, she glanced at the downstairs to assess her progress. Cleaner than her place. Hopefully Ted would approve. She held her breath as he conducted his dramatic and thorough inspection, his hands folded behind his back. After an eternity, he simply gave her a nod. That's better, Teresa. I knew my wife could learn to be a good housekeeper someday. Liz bit her swollen lip to keep from gasping. His wife? Is that who Teresa was? If so, where was she now? Or, maybe a better question, would Liz meet the same fate Teresa had? Her head buzzed, and a tear threatened to escape from her eyelashes. What's the matter, Teresa? Ted stepped closer, his tone a mix of concern and irritation. Before she could stop herself, Liz allowed the tear to spill on her cheek. I just want to go home. Ted stiffened. A blue vein bulged under the red skin of his forehead. Before Liz could react, he lunged at her and punched her several times in the abdomen. Through the beating, Liz heard him shouting, "You are home. This is your home, Teresa. Your home is with me. I am your home." His thirst for violence finally quenched, Ted marched Liz down to the basement and chained her to the pipe while she sobbed and coughed up blood. She could come upstairs, he said, once she apologized for her rebellious attitude. Liz dropped her head back to look at the basement's ceiling. "A lot of help you are." If she ever saw Carla again, she'd have to tell her that God wasn't all she made him out to be. Chapter 4. The next 2 days bounced between periods of boredom and periods of terror. Liz made it her goal to appease Ted in every area, though she was relieved every evening to find she hadn't made him happy enough to update her sleeping arrangements. Her plan seemed to be working. Each evening, she calculated less bruises and more freedom. She learned soon enough that every request Ted made was a test. If she passed, the reins loosened. If she failed, she bled. At noon on Wednesday, Liz was elated to see her missing persons story on the tiny television in the kitchen as she washed the dishes. Ted noticed the report too, though he kept quiet about it. After lunch, he stood up and asked her to walk to the mailbox and bring in the mail. She tried to hide her excitement and resisted the urge to bounce up and down on her toes. At last, she would see the outside world and inhale some fresh air. Maybe she'd meet a neighbor, tell them she was the missing girl from the news, let them see her injuries, and ask them to help. Ted watched her from his post at the door. Liz limped slowly down the winding driveway toward the mailbox, her bare feet crunching painfully on the gravel driveway. Her greedy gaze ate up the scenery and tried to detect the slightest bit of movement or sound of life. But there wasn't another human being in sight. Her stomach soured. The trees pressed in too thickly for Liz to see if her cabin prison was the only place around, and her body slumped at the lack of information she was able to gather about her surroundings. As she opened the mailbox and found it as empty as it was rusty, she realized that no mail had the potential to arrive at the unmarked container. Ted was simply investigating to see if she'd try to run after the news report. If she attempted an escape, he would hunt her down in the woods and kill her like an animal. Like he'd probably done with the real Teresa. Heart crashing to the rocky ground, Liz trudged heavily back into the cabin and tried not to let the last of her hope shrivel up and die at the sound of each lock clicking behind her. Chapter 5. A week had passed since her capture, and the news reporters dropped her missing persons story in favor of an epidemic of measles in the local elementary schools. The outdated photograph the news anchors had flashed on screen, a girl with long brown hair and a toothy grin, looked nothing like her now, anyway. People probably assumed she was simply a teenage runaway. That story wouldn't be a hard sell to her parents, with all they'd been through with her over the years. Why had she been such a brat to them? Carla was close with her parents. Why couldn't Liz have been more like her? Liz tried not to let Ted see the emotion on her face as he clipped his toenails at the kitchen table and she heated soup on the stove. Every past argument with her parents seemed so petty now. She had always taken them for granted, resisting their overprotective boundaries, but now she appreciated their concern for her. She longed to tell them she loved them, that she knew they'd always tried their best. She wanted to tell them she was sorry for being selfish, sorry for not trying to understand their side of things, sorry for going to school so far away in spite of their obvious wishes for her to stay closer to home. Liz allowed a small sigh to escape her lungs and forced herself to stop thinking about the parents she'd likely never see again. She quietly stirred the pot of hot soup and resigned to someday sneaking upstairs and locating the knife Ted had used to cut her hair. If she wanted to be in a place where no one could hurt her anymore, she'd have to commit murder to get there. But her desperate plans shifted the next morning after Ted finished his breakfast. "Teresa," he said while plopping a tattered pair of woman's sandals on the table. "We're going shopping." He handcuffed her wrists to the car door once she lowered herself into the passenger seat. After a silent minute of traveling, Liz saw a road sign welcoming travelers to her college town. He was keeping her mere miles from her own apartment building. Blood careened through her veins, warming her spirits. A small piece of an escape plan crept into Liz's mind. When Ted pulled into a small convenience store, parked the car, and loosed her chains, she tried to steady her nerves and not look too excited or suspicious. This was her chance. God, if you're there, if you're real, please help me this time. Please. Ted dragged her into the store, hand painfully squeezing her upper arm, and she looked around. A middle-aged man she assumed to be the cashier read a newspaper from his seated position behind the counter. A mother and two small children browsed the boxes of donuts near the storefront. Ted pulled Liz along to the beer cooler. Sucking in a deep breath, Liz stiffened and decided to capitalize on her only audience in days. She couldn't scream that this man was a kidnapper without putting the mother and children in danger of becoming Ted's next targets. But she could fake a medical event. Maybe Ted would even believe she was in need of a hospital. She clutched her stomach and crumpled to her knees, groaning and squirming enough to capture everyone's undivided attention. The motion surprised Ted enough to make him loosen his hold on her arm.
Ah! My stomach! Oh, my stomach! My appendix is bursting! Please, Ted! Ted, call an ambulance! I'm going to die! Ted!
Her high school acting class must have paid off, because the man behind the counter jumped off his stool and grabbed the nearby phone, dialing the emergency number before Ted realized she was faking her sudden illness. "Get up," he growled through clenched teeth. He reached behind his back and produced a shiny silver gun Liz had never seen before. As the cashier began to dial, Ted shot him through the chest 3 times without flinching. The other customer grabbed her children and fled as Ted aimed at them. Liz screamed and elbowed him in the stomach before he could shoot any of them. He lurched forward, firing a shot into the floor. "Let them get away. Please." Ted cursed, grabbed a 6-pack of beer, and hustled Liz into the car, searching madly for the woman and her children, but there was no trace of them anywhere. Liz breathed a silent prayer of thanks. Ted started the engine and sped off in the direction of the lonesome cabin in the woods, and Liz turned to watch in horror as her only chance of freedom grew further and further away. Chapter 6. Ted bound and gagged Liz in the basement after what he deemed to be a sufficient beating. Liz refused to cry. She deserved whatever she got. After all, that cashier who tried to call 911 for her was dead now because of her rash decision. And those little children and their mother would be traumatized for the rest of their lives after witnessing that cold-blooded murder. She was back to square one, or worse. Stuck in the dank basement, bruised, bleeding, and crying until Ted decided she needed another round of humbling. "Why didn't you help me, God? Why did you let Ted kill that man? Why didn't you let him at least make the call so the police could be looking for me? Do you want me stuck here forever? Why? I'm Carla's friend. Carla goes to church every single Sunday. Why can't you help me as a favor to her? Don't you care?" After an hour of trying to wriggle the handcuffs into a more comfortable position and whining to God, Liz heard a knock at the front door. Her heart rate quickened. Maybe someone had seen them leave the convenience store. Maybe her plan had been more successful than she'd thought. Muffled voice, one female, one male, and one monster, floated down the stairs. She tried to scream, but the gag snuffed at her every cry. She slammed her hands on the pipe overhead, but the only sound she could produce was a dull thud. After a few moments, the voices stopped, the door closed, and Ted came downstairs, chest puffed out, and a grin on his face. "The police won't be coming back here anytime soon." He grinned. Told them I haven't left this cabin in years. Said I grow all my own food and I'm off the grid. They asked to look around, but didn't press it when I said not without a warrant. Besides, they had most of my license plate written down, so how could I let them in the garage to see the car they were searching for? I told them I'd contact them if I saw anything shady going on around here. Had them eating out of the palm of my hand. You married one sly fox, Teresa. He smiled wickedly and gave her a clumsy pat on the head. What do you think of that? He loosened her gag so she could congratulate him. As the gag was pulled from her mouth, the bubble of safety Liz had been trying to maintain for days popped. She didn't care if he beat her to death, she couldn't live like this anymore. God surely wasn't going to help her now, and neither were the police. Staggering into a half-standing position, she inhaled madly through her nostrils and spat on him.
My name is not Teresa. It's Elizabeth. Elizabeth Marie Peterson. Do you hear me? I'm a 19-year-old college freshman and I'm done with the games. Kill me if you want, just like you killed Teresa. I don't care anymore. Kill me.
She gasped for breath and collapsed, trembling and sobbing onto the floor.
Just kill me so they can find my body and arrest you for my murder.
Instead of exploding, Ted bent down, seized the back of her head, and gave her a sloppy kiss on the mouth. Liz screamed as his lips engulfed hers, and sunk away as soon as he released her. Before he carefully reinserted the gag and climbed the stairs, Ted whispered, I wish it didn't have to end this way, Teresa. I really do love you. After Ted slammed the basement door behind him, classical music blared full blast from above. Liz shivered and tried to ignore the dirty taste in her mouth, from the rag or the unwanted kiss, she couldn't tell. Maybe the loud music was intended to psych him up for the kill. Is this how it ends, God, huh? You're going to let him kill me after I've begged for your help? Is this how you treat people? Liz sniffled. Maybe she should play nicer with God if she were going to be meeting him sooner rather than later. She shuddered. Listen, I'm sorry. I'm just worried. Scared, really. Terrified is more like it. Can't you do anything about this? Carla can't say enough good about you. Says you're all-powerful. Can you help me? If you get me out of this, I promise to start going to church with Carla every single Sunday. I'll go and see what this Christian stuff is all about. Okay? I promise. Just get me out of here, and I'll do it. Please. I'm begging you. You're my only hope. She shut her eyes, let the tears roll down her cheeks, and tried not to think about her many unanswered prayers. Chapter 7. A loud noise jarred Liz awake, and she tried to place the sound as her aching body reminded her how much it detested sleeping in a crouched position on the basement floor. She heard the noise again. Pounding. More pounding. Louder pounding. Was he building something? Her casket? He'd have to do something with her corpse. But as the din continued, the pounding sounded less of hammering and more of fist on door. An unfamiliar voice called out, and many hasty footsteps thundered above her head. Angry voices, stomping feet, shouting, jingling. Liz didn't know what to make of the commotion, so she stayed put, hoping not to fall into the jaws of something worse than she'd already created for herself. The basement door swung open, letting sunlight pour into the cold, dank space. Several pairs of boots clambered down the steps, and in one moment of elated relief, Liz recognized the uniforms of the NYPD. A male officer clasped Ted's arms behind his back and struggled to restrain him. A female officer rushed over to Liz with a ring of keys. Once she was free, Ted lost it. You can't take her. She's my wife. She's mine. She belongs to me. He wriggled free of the cop's grip and lunged at Liz, screaming unintelligible obscenities. 2 officers drew their guns and shot him in the back. He slammed to the floor, dark red blood oozing out of his gaping mouth. A surreal numbness overtook Liz as she gawked at Ted's lifeless form. Her pulse tapped out an unsteady beat. The monster was dead? She was free? She stared at his body for a long time, making sure he wasn't breathing. At long last, her trance was broken by the policewoman. "Where are your shoes?" The female officer helped her upstairs to locate her shoes, socks, and cell phone. Once they opened Ted's bedroom door, Liz shuddered. Thousands of pictures of a short-haired blonde woman about Liz's height and build plastered the walls. Teresa. The officer searched the room while Liz waited in the hallway. After a moment, she was reunited with her shoes, socks, and cell phone. "We got lucky with your case," the woman said as Liz sat down to dress her filthy blistered feet. "A woman at the convenience store shooting called with a partial plate number and told us a man named Ted shot the store owner and tried to shoot her too, but she escaped on foot into the woods with her kids. Poor things, they were scared to pieces." Liz swallowed hard. So, her plan hadn't been a complete failure. But someone had died and 3 people were scarred for life because of her desperate decision. "We traced the plate and the name to the piece of property where this cabin stands. After we left without permission to search yesterday, we did some more digging and found the composite sketch the woman and children were able to give matched a man by the name of Daniel Theodore Phillips, an ex-cop from Wyoming suspected of murdering his partner, Teresa Morrison, after she rejected his marriage proposal. Turns out he's a suspect for serial kidnapping, rape, and murder as well. Victims scattered all across the country for the past 5 years." Liz glanced at the pictures in Ted's room again and massaged the back of her scalp. Her heart thundered in her rib cage. The beatings were bad, but things could have turned out so much worse. Maybe God had been helping her more than she realized. She couldn't wait to take a shower and gargle a bottle of Listerine to rinse out her mouth. Not that either of those things could ever wash the past week away from her memory. But first, she'd call her parents and have a long talk filled with humble apologies. Then she'd talk to Carla and block off her schedule every weekend for a trip to Pennsylvania to visit her roommate's church. A promise was a promise after all, and God had certainly held up his end of the bargain. The paramedics addressed her more serious scrapes and cuts and proclaimed her miraculously healthy considering the circumstances. God must be the one to thank for that, too. After refusing a trip to the hospital, Liz stepped out of the cabin for the first time as a free woman. She checked her phone to see several missed calls and texts from her parents. She couldn't wait to hear their voices again. "You need a lift into town, miss?" one of the male police officers asked, opening the passenger door to his police cruiser. Liz smiled and shook her head. "No thanks," she said. "I think I'll call my roommate for a ride."